So he subtitled in the program, my program, to be Surprising Eastern Star Connections, and we certainly will discuss those. But I'm going to also go a little bit deeper and discuss how Freemasonry influenced the Western expansion of the United States and use the Ingalls family life to illustrate that. So, Little Lodge on the Prairie Revisited. When you hear the word prairie, what is the first thing you think of? If you're an American, I don't know about the rest of the places, it's Little House on the Prairie because of the TV show of that name. It turned the word prairie into a common word with visions of pioneers, the westward expansion, good family values, and self-sufficiency. What most people don't think of when they hear the word prairie is Freemasonry, but maybe they should, because it played a large part in the expansion of the West during the whole Gilded Age, which is the period after the Civil War to the turn of the century. And a look at the lives of the Ingalls will show us how. Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, this is not Michael Landon, but the real Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, were married in 1860 in Wisconsin. That's where they began their life together. They had 2 daughters there, Mary and Laura. Charles was a farmer and Carolyn minded the home. They lived near the town of Pepin on the Mississippi River for about 10 years, but then the area started getting too crowded for Charles. He liked to be self-sufficient, and that was getting harder to do. The logging industry had boomed. The town had grown up. People were too close for him. This paralleled what was happening nationwide. In urban areas, mechanization and industrialization were replacing handcrafters. Corporations repressed independent entrepreneurs. Factories and tenements were the common man's arena, while so-called robber barons, like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie, and other wealthy men, grew rich off of them. Even farmers were affected, as commodity brokers manipulated their fees, railroads charged exorbitant shipping, and inflation ate their profits. Across the nation, railroads were taking land, local politics were often corrupt, and discrimination was rampant. All of these factors led to a loss of trust in the government, as well as in businessmen, financiers, and other people of power. So people wanted a more even playing field. That desire was one reason of the popularity of Freemasonry and other fraternities during the Gilded Age. As you all know, in the lodge, all men meet on the level. So whether you were a farmer, a banker, a mayor, even the governor, everyone could meet equally. Nowhere else but the fraternities could the common man be on equal footing with the elite of society. So Charles Ingalls wanted a hand up too. He didn't join the fraternity just yet, though. Instead, he took the advice of his cousin, who was a senator, who told him that there was going to be a treaty made with the Osage in Indian Territory, what's now Kansas, and that area would grow up and be a wonderful place to live. He convinced Charles, and he moved his family there. They stayed long enough for their 3rd daughter, Carrie, to be born in Indian Territory, but the native population did not take kindly to the settlers, and so Charles moved his family back to Wisconsin after about a year. They stayed just a short time before moving on to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. You might recognize that name from the television show. In Walnut Grove, they had several benefits of living in a town, such as church and school. Charles and Carolyn were both civic-minded and religious, and they demonstrated those ideals every day in their life. Again, this reflected what was happening across the country. During the Gilded Age was the setting of the Third Great Awakening. That was a period of religious fervency. It began during the turbulent years leading up to the Civil War and continued until the turn of the century. Looking for peace in a divided nation, many Americans turned to religion, and they believed that God would restore the nation when it returned to him. So they emphasized a strict moral conduct according to their understanding of the Bible. The Ingalls family was as faithful as most Americans. For instance, they were present in August 1874 when the Congregational Church was established in Walnut Grove. They were charter members, and Charles and Carolyn were baptized at the very first service. Of course, they attended regularly, and the girls went to Sunday school. One of Laura's books, On the Banks of Plum Creek, she tells a story that Pa, Charles, saved for many weeks to buy a new pair of boots because his old ones were worn clean through. And just before he was on his way to go buy the boots, when the pastor approached him for a donation for the new bell for the church, and he gave all the money that he had saved up for his boots for the bell instead. And Laura wrote in the book that it was only $3, but the church records show it was $27, which was a good amount for a poor farmer in those days. Now, despite the importance that most Americans placed on faith and godly values during that time, there was also an emphasis on enlightenment and rationalism. Society saw itself as moving away from old superstitions and progressing toward industry and science and the technology of the time. So there were many people who, although they still accepted the idea of the need of morals and faith, they rejected the dogma and what they saw as intrusive rules of organized religion. Freemasonry provided a place for the men who felt this way. As the Book of Constitutions of the United Grand Lodge of England states, a Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he will never be a stupid atheist or an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country, whatever it was, yet now is thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion to which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves. That is, to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty, by whatever denomination or persuasion they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons who must have remained at a perpetual distance. So, I just skipped my thing here. So that's what I just read. Okay. In the Gilded Age, education was almost as valued as faith, and the Ingalls family demonstrated this as well. Throughout the Little House books, education is shown to be a privilege. It should be taken advantage of whenever possible. Such as Charles explains to Laura in one book, it isn't everybody that gets a chance to learn to read and write and cipher. Your ma was a school teacher when we met, and when she came west with me, I promised that our girls would have a chance to get book learning. That's why we stopped here, so close to a town that has a school. Be thankful you've got the chance, Laura. So, and then when they were not in a town or near a school, Carolyn, of course, taught the girls at home. And the fact that she was very diligent in this is proved by the fact that every time they returned to school, they were always well ahead of their classmates. Freemasonry, of course, also promoted the search for truth and knowledge, including through public education. As I'm sure you all know, Masons have always been at the forefront of establishing the schools and public education in America and across Europe as well. They wanted to improve society. They saw that politics and religion, though, often had the opposite result, so they wanted a way that people could come together to improve society instead, and thus the lodges were the perfect avenue for that. It is a way to give equal opportunity to all people, or all men in that time, and is so entrenched in the idea of Freemasonic principles that even the rites and rituals emphasize pursuing knowledge in science, math, and the liberal arts. So the Ingalls taking advantage of church and school in Walnut Grove reflected both the mindset of Americans during the westward expansion and the values of Freemasonry. And there's another facet of their life that mirrored how Freemasonry helped build America. When they moved to Walnut Grove, Charles said, "In Wisconsin, we lived among Swedes and Germans. In Indian Territory, we lived among the Indians. Now here in Minnesota, all the neighbors are Norwegian. They're good neighbors too, but I guess our kind of folks is pretty scarce." At that time, the nation was still looking for ways to come together after all the hatred and distrust of the Civil War. It was hard enough for the Americans to unite, but then you added in the 12 million immigrants that arrived between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the new century. That was more than had come in the preceding 70 years. So the often bewildering ways of the newcomers made many citizens uneasy or even afraid. Some things, I guess, never change. The face of society had a new look, and it was different from what the Americans had known, so friction often developed among them. Also, even though America prided itself on being a nation without a formal class structure, the fact was that foreigners were often relegated to a lower social class. They often weren't fluent in English and did not have much money or worldly goods, so they had to work harder to be respected. But the fraternities were one way that they could gain this respect. As previously discussed, everyone in the lodge was on equal footing, so the immigrant and the natural-born citizen could be equally socially accepted there. And this wasn't the case just for immigrants, but other societal differences were smoothed over, such as labor and capitalism. Union workers, scabs, those are workers who would not join a union, and their employers might all have differing views of employment, but if they're going to meet as brothers in the lodge, it behooved them to behave as such in the workplace as well. But again, there's a paradox to this. Freemasonry also attracted men who clung to the stability and norms of the society they'd always known. Because although in the lodge everyone was equal, the lodge didn't accept just anyone. Potential members had to be vetted and found worthy. So the men who enjoyed a higher social class could congratulate themselves on still only associating with worthy men. Adding to the prestige were the degrees and ranks. Men who were confused by the quickly changing social order around them found comfort in being part of a fraternity that had been essentially the same for 100 years or more. In addition, the degrees provided a means for members to continue progressing ever higher. This was again in accord with the westward traveling pioneers who had a strong work ethic and valued personal achievement. So back to the Ingalls, despite having a church and school and good neighbors, even if they were a different kind of folks, the Ingalls' time in Walnut Grove was not all happy. As soon as they moved there, Charles bought a farm, but his timing was terrible, and that was the first of 4 years of locust swarms. They decimated all the crops in that area, so Charles had to leave his family to the mercy of neighbors while he traveled on foot in his worn-out boots to other counties and even other states to find work. When he returned in the fall, Carolyn was nearing time of delivery of their next child. So Charles rented a house in town. She'd be closer to the doctor. Their son, Charles Frederick, was born there, but he died only a few months later. It was about that time that a friend of Charles purchased a hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, and he asked Charles to run the place for him. Since he had no other prospects in Walnut Grove, Charles accepted, and they moved there. The whole family worked there, even the girls, who were not, other than Mary, who was barely a teenager. The others were not even teenagers, but all of them worked there. And Carolyn needed this extra help because she was once again in the family way, and she gave birth to Grace, the fourth daughter, while they lived in Burr Oak, Iowa. Soon after she was born, the owner of the hotel sold it. Again, Charles was out of a job. He heard from friends that the grasshoppers were gone, so he moved back to Walnut Grove. The girls went back to school again. The family rejoined the church. Mary was baptized, and Charles was made a trustee. Civic responsibilities also called, and Charles was elected the first justice of the peace in Walnut Grove in 1879. This is yet one more way in which the life of the Ingalls illustrates the principles of Freemasonry and the American mindset in the westward expansion. Charles and Carolyn were raised with the idea of civic duty as expressed by John Adams, who stated that a healthy society relies on individual self-sacrifice for the greater good and a willingness to make the business of government an important aspect of their personal lives. Civic duty was truly a personal responsibility of every citizen that must be performed. No getting out of jury duty. This thinking began to change in the latter part of the 19th century, but for most of the pioneers who were moving west during that time, this was the ideal that they subscribed to. So they were very active in community efforts and local politics. Freemasonry also promotes a form of patriotism that parallels that conviction. In the very first charge given to a newly initiated Mason, he's instructed to be a quiet and peaceful subject, true to your government and just to your country. You are not to countenance disloyalty or rebellion, but patiently submit to legal authority and conform with cheerfulness to the government of the country in which you live. And that, of course, is reinforced in each degree of the craft. I'll give another quote of two Grand Masters who said, "Loyalty carries with it the highest obligation of citizenship. Obedience to law, respect for constitutional authority, a recognition of the right of every human being to enjoyment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The rights we enjoy as citizens carry with them corresponding duties. No good Freemason will fail to be a good citizen and found on the side of decency, civic righteousness, and public order." Charles Ingalls' first role as a civil servant took place in Pepin, where he and Carolyn were married when he served on the school board, and his later life also contained many examples. Outside of being a justice of the peace, he also worked as a carpenter and a butcher in Walnut Grove. But hard times continued to follow. Carolyn became very ill. They had to have the doctor 3 times before she recovered, so they had a pile of doctor bills. And then Mary became ill, the oldest daughter, so they had even more doctor's bills. And although Mary did recover, she was left blind. So when Charles was given the opportunity to work a summer for the railroad, which was the highest paying industry of the time, it seemed providential, and of course he jumped on it. He took the job of paymaster. It lasted just the summer, and in the fall, where the line stopped, there was nothing there, but he brought the family there because he knew there would be a town. And sure enough, as soon as winter waned enough that travel was possible, one of the first people to come through was a congregational minister, Reverend Alden. He stopped in to visit the Ingalls, being the only people on the prairie at that time, and held a church service. So the very first service in what would become DeSmet, South Dakota, was held in the Ingalls home. Reverend Alden established the congregational church there, and the Ingalls family remained members their entire lives. Charles also secured a home site near DeSmet for the homestead. Being a first year, not much would grow, and then came the hard winter, which is still notorious to this day. That was the winter of 1880 and 81, where there were blizzards for 8 solid months. Townspeople ran out of supplies, including food and coal for fuel, so they went hungry. And then Laura writes that 2 young men from town risked their lives to go try to find. They had only an estimate of a location of a man who might have some seed wheat that he might sell, and if they could convince him to sell his seed wheat, then the town would have something to live on. So they did that. They risked their lives. They were successful. They found the man, bought the wheat, and miraculously, no one starved to death in that entire winter. As one of the earliest settlers of DeSmet, Charles was able to take a leading role in the community. Some of the ways he served were as justice of the peace, deputy sheriff, school board member, town clerk, and street commissioner. He had several different occupations over the years as well, including a farmer, carpenter, storekeeper, and he was even an insurance salesman for a while. In November 1881, Mary, the oldest daughter who had lost her sight, was enrolled in the Iowa College for the Blind. She had a very rigorous course there. She learned everything that a sighted person learns in school: reading, writing, math, so forth, history, chemistry. And she also had to learn some way to make herself useful in society. So she learned to play the organ. She learned beadwork and knitting, sewing. She memorized every song in the hymnal and was the congregational church organist for many years, even though she couldn't see a word of it or a note of it. Laura and Carrie, at that time, were still going to school, but Laura also had to work to contribute to the family income. She did house sitting. She made hats for a while. She was a seamstress, whatever she could find, basically. Then in 1882, she earned her teacher certificate and began teaching in 1883. She alternated. In those days, it was not uncommon for a teacher to still also be a student. So she would teach one term, go back to school one term, teach in one term, and so forth. She also began to be courted by a young man named Almanza Wilder from a neighboring farm. He was one of the 2 men who went to purchase the seed wheat and save the town from starving during the hard winter. Laura and Almanza were married in August of 1885. It was just a few months after that that Charles petitioned De Smet Masonic Lodge for membership. He was initiated as an entered apprentice in 1886, passed to the degree of fellowcraft a couple months later, and raised as a master mason a few months after that. He held his first office, which was Tyler, in 1888, and for the rest of his life, he held an office every single year in the lodge. Some of those were junior deacon, treasurer, junior warden, senior warden, and junior steward. In 1891, Bethlehem chapter number 13 of the Order of the Eastern Star was formed in De Smet. Carolyn was one of the charter members. She was a well-respected founding member of the community, so it's not surprising she would be part of this new endeavor. Charles was not a charter member, but he did join a couple years later in 1894. Throughout these years, Charles finally gave up on farming entirely. He never could make a living at it. He built a home for the family in town, and they lived there for the remainder of their lives. Charles, again, just did whatever odd jobs he could find while Carolyn minded the home. Mary graduated from the blind school in 1889, and she returned home to spend the rest of her days there. The youngest daughter, Grace, graduated from high school in De Smet, went to a nearby college. She taught for a few years, and then she married a local farmer and lived near her ma and pa for the rest of their lives. Carrie was involved in the Young People's League at the church and other activities in town. Her health was always frail, but she was still a popular girl. And when the Order of the Eastern Star was formed in De Smet, she was a charter member, as well as being immediately installed into the office of warder. Charles died of heart failure in 1902 at the age of 66. Not only did he receive a Masonic funeral, but the lodge paid for his tombstone and for all of his final expenses as well. This is yet another example of one reason that people would join a fraternity, particularly lodges, in those days. There was no welfare, no social security, no kind of social network, safety network at all. Some fraternities provided insurance benefits. Of course, Masonry didn't do that, but they did provide support in many other ways, both moral and financially, such as they did with Charles Ingalls when he passed away. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that the lodges in the 16th century began accepting speculative members. Those were members who were very high up in society, and they could replenish the charity box, which was being drawn from much more as the work of building the cathedrals and stuff was waning. So Masons also provided relief for their communities as they were able, and they established schools and orphanages, houses for widows, things like that. The building of these facilities is a major way that Freemasonry helped build up America, both literally and in character. And in doing so, they built up their own reputation as an organization that a man could be proud of joining. After Charles' death, Ma and Mary remained in the home he'd built. Mary made the income by doing fancy needlework that she had learned in college and selling it. And as I said, they lived there the rest of their lives. Carolyn died in 1924 at the age of 84. Mary died in 1928, and Grace in 1941. The sister Carrie had a little bit more interesting life. After she graduated from high school, she was able to travel a bit all over the Northwest. When she was in De Smet, she very seldom missed a meeting of the Eastern Star. When you go through the old minutes there, you will see her name in just about every meeting in some form or other. She worked her way through most of the offices and became worthy matron in 1903. Some meetings, she even held 2 offices at the same meeting because there weren't enough people there, so she filled in for the others who weren't there. In 1907, Carrie took her own claim near Phillips, South Dakota. She built her own claim shanty, and she lived on it by herself for the required time to call it her own, which I think was 2 years. During that time, she also worked several jobs, including clerking at local stores, working in the post office, teaching school, and the newspaper business. That turned out to be her love. She began working for the local paper at age 19, and over the next 5 years, she learned all aspects of the business. A major newspaper man named E.L. Sin noticed her work, and he hired her. He was known for establishing towns in all of the up-and-coming boom towns where mining or whatever different industries were building up, and there was no newspaper yet. So he would hire Carrie. She would go to this new town, establish the newspaper till it was running well, and then she'd leave it to the care of someone else and go to the next town where there wasn't a newspaper and build it up. She continued to do that until she was transferred to Keystone in 1911, and that is where her life changed. She met a man, as women are wont to do. His name was David Swansea. He was an Eastern Star, and that's where she met him. He was also a miner. He was a widower with 2 children. David and Carrie didn't have children of their own, but she raised his 2 children as if they were her own. After marriage, she stopped working in the newspaper business, but she still remained very active in the community. She was a clerk for the Congregational Church, president of the Ladies' Aid Society. She helped establish reading programs and helped fund a library. She also transferred her Eastern Star membership to Mount Etna chapter in Keystone, and she was just as active there as she had been in DeSmet. Her first office in Keystone was Esther in 1914. Carrie's husband, David, also was very active in the Masonic fraternity. He was one who had helped establish the lodge in Keystone in 1896. He was also one who helped establish that Eastern Star chapter in 1899. That was, of course, before Carrie got there. He was very dedicated to the lodge and star. Now, one of the greatest symbols of America's westward expansion is Mount Rushmore. Freemasonry and members of the Ingalls family were directly involved in several aspects of the creation of this great monument. Carrie's husband, David, was a guide. He was a miner also. He also acted for attorneys who were coming to look at mines for their client to see if they thought it was going to be a good investment or not. So one day he was showing a man around, an attorney from New York, and this attorney wanted to know the names of everything. What's this place called? What's that cave called? And he asked, well, what is that mountain over there called? It had several local names, but it didn't have an official name. So David Swansea said, well, we'll name it after you. And the attorney's name was Charles Rushmore. So that is how Mount Rushmore got named. A few years later, South Dakota's state historian, who was a man named Doane Robinson, came to Keystone. Since he was a Freemason, he visited the lodge where he met David Swansea. Robinson was looking for a place to install a national monument, and David acted as his guide. The place they picked was a place in the Badlands called the Needles, which is some unique, fingery-looking rock formations. They turned to another Freemason, a senator named Peter Norbeck, to procure funding for the project, and they brought in Gutzon Borglum to do the work. Now, Borglum was also a Freemason and a famous sculptor. He did not like the site that they had chosen. He said it was too weak, the formations wouldn't hold up. So he looked around and he liked the peak that David had named, Mount Rushmore. David and Carrie became friends with Borglum as he attended lodge with David when he was in Keystone. They also befriended Peter Norbeck and Doane Robinson in the same way. In addition, Carrie helped host all the visitors when Calvin Coolidge, the president, came to dedicate the site before the carving began. And David's son, Harold, was one of the carvers to work on the monument. So the intersection of David and Carrie's lives with Freemasonry and the building of Mount Rushmore, which symbolizes America's expansion, is a perfect example of how the fraternity and the building of the country influenced each other. So Carrie participated in other things as well. In the Eastern Star chapter alone, she helped with special observances for Christmas and Easter, patriotic gatherings. During the war years, she supported the Red Cross, made bandages, gathered donations. She was worthy matron in the Eastern Star chapter when they began a war prisoner fund to help bring home the prisoners of war. All of her many activities demonstrate another reason pioneers were drawn to Freemasonry and other fraternities, and that is social interaction. Life on the prairie could be lonely. Everyone was busy with their own work. There were myriad chores. There just wasn't much time to socialize. Homesteads were often miles apart, and even in town, it took all the hours of the day just to make a living. So lodge meetings provided an opportunity for them to get together in a more social aspect. And not only at the meetings, but also the other social functions that they held, the Christmas parties and patriotic gatherings, things like that. Not only that, but by visiting the lodge and local Eastern Star chapter, people could get to network and expand. You could visit other lodges and expand your network of associates. And usually these associates would be the men of influence in communities. That was especially important to businessmen and politicians. Carrie is said to have never missed an Eastern Star meeting except the week her husband David died. At his death in 1938, he received a Masonic burial and an Eastern Star service. On June 1st, 1946, Carrie celebrated 55 years as a member of the Order of the Eastern Star. The chapter held a special observance for her, and then she died very unexpectedly just a few days later. She had 2 Eastern Star services, one in Keystone, where she was living at the time, and then one in DeSmet, where she was buried next to her parents. Now, meanwhile, Almanzo and Laura had a very disastrous first 4 years of marriage. Between hail, drought, and fire, they lost every crop and 2 homes. They contracted diphtheria, which left Almanzo crippled. They lost a son who died just a few days after birth. The only happy event was the birth of their daughter, Rose. So after a few years in DeSmet and being besieged by all these calamities, they thought they would go somewhere else and start over. They first tried Florida, but they did not like the climate there. So they returned back to DeSmet. And it was while they were in Florida that the Bethlehem chapter of Eastern Star was formed, which is why Laura was not a charter member. But as soon as they moved back, she did join. And she was also immediately installed into the Star Point of Ada. However, they were not there but a few weeks when they decided to try Missouri. They purchased a small farm there, had an apple orchard, and it was a very hardscrabble existence for a few years, but they did make it work. They took every job they could find, picking and selling berries, chopping cordwood and selling it, delivering meals to railroad workers, anything they could think of to do. As soon as they got established, Almanzo joined the Masonic Lodge in Mansfield. He maintained his membership there his entire life, and he held the office of Tyler several years. Of course, Laura never joined the Masonic Lodge, nor did her mother or sister. As has been discussed this morning, women have traditionally been barred from that fraternity. There were many reasons given for this. One is that the fraternity is built on building King Solomon's temple, and women didn't participate in that. Another is that, well, you would have to bare your left breast, and are you going to do that in a room full of men? Then there's the fact that the old charges say, no, you have to be a freeborn man to be a member, and if you break this charge, you're not really a Mason. So also there was the fact that women couldn't speak for themselves. In those days, the husband or father, as the case may be, was the head of the woman, made all her decisions for her. If she took an oath to help you in your time of need and you called upon her, if her husband said, no, you can't go, she was in a kind of a pickle there. Did she disobey her husband, which was really a bad thing considered to do, or did she go back on her vow she had made? So that's another reason that was given. Of course, this has changed in recent years, and today there are co-Masonic lodges. Many lodges have decided that any kind of discrimination is no more acceptable in the lodge than it is anywhere else. And so maybe someday all lodges will be gender integrated. It's very interesting to note that the man who said Freemasonry would be dead if they accepted women might want to consider the fact that people said that back when it was only the Stonemasons Guild, and then people started accepting speculative Masons. Of course, that was an evolution of the lodge. It changed what it was. And accepting females might do the same thing, but maybe it would be a better thing. If Freemasonry hadn't evolved then, it wouldn't exist now. So just something to think about. So when Laura was in Mansfield, she became one of the organizers of the chapter of the Eastern Star there, Mansfield chapter. That first year, she had not transferred her membership, so she couldn't hold an office officially, but she was the pro tem secretary for that entire year. And then after that year, she was installed as an office every year. I think I might have a little bit on that. Okay, and even with all the work he had to do on the farm and his service in the lodge, Almanzo also joined the Eastern Star a few years later. And he also didn't shirk his civic responsibilities either. He served in the community in many ways. He was on the highway committee that built a highway actually right through his farm. And he was a frequent superintendent of the county fair and several other aspects like that. Laura became known as an expert poultry keeper. She was so recognized in this field that she was often invited to give presentations at Grange meetings and other agricultural meetings. One day she couldn't go to the meeting, so she wrote out a speech and sent it for someone else to read. And there happened to be the editor of a well-known agricultural magazine called the Missouri Ruralist in the audience at that meeting. And he was so impressed with the speech that he contacted Laura and asked her to be a regular contributor to the magazine, which she did. That was her very first writing experience. She eventually became the editor of the home section of that magazine. All her writings revolved around home life in a small town or on a farm. They included of virtue, integrity, honesty, charity, all the same virtues that Freemasonry and Eastern Star promote. She also found time to work in the community. She worked with the Missouri Women's Home Development Association, and the first important thing she did that she was extremely proud of was she was able to establish ladies' restrooms in all the trading centers. No one had thought that the ladies might need a facility just like the men, so she took care of that problem. They also remained extremely active in the Eastern Star. I'm not going to go through all the offices they held because there were 40 years worth of them. We'd be here all day. But like her sister Carrie, Laura did hold every office at some point, and she held most of them multiple times. Almanzo was also an officer many years, most often as sentinel, but he did serve a few as warder and even treasurer once. Some of the other highlights of their time in the order, Laura was worthy matron 3 times. During her time as worthy matron, she would not allow a ritual book at any station. Every work must be done by memory and must be perfect. She was a real stickler about that. In 1904, she was selected as the district deputy grand lecturer, so she got to visit all the chapters in her district and report on them at the grand chapter. Of course, that was still in the days of the horse and buggy, too. She was often the installing officer for the area chapters, and she was so recognized in that work that one chapter gave her a gold pin in recognition of her excellent recitations of the work. After 40 years, Almanzo and Laura did ask for a demit. There were 2 reasons for this. One is it was 1931, and they were really struggling financially. Their daughter, Rose, who had been fairly well off, had installed electricity in their home. They had that cut off. They cut every possible expense they could, and so their dues were part of that was cut. Another reason was that Laura was embarking on her new career as a writer of children's books. She said later that she realized she had lived through a pivotal time in American history. From horse and buggy to railway to automobile and even airplane, she flew to Connecticut once to see her daughter. So we think of Little House on the Prairie. You don't think of her flying in an airplane, but she did. That was the whole expanse of time. But she wanted to teach children that despite that kind of change, the important things of life, like faith and family, still remained the same. So she was 65 years old when her first book was published. This is right around that time. That book, Little House in the Big Woods, was an instant success. The stories of family togetherness touched readers, and adults recognized the larger message that there's always challenges and tough times, but with determination, you can work through them and find satisfaction in simple everyday pleasures. This emphasis on self-reliance and joy in simple living appealed to the innate need of security of readers living in an insecure time. So each of the successive Little House books met with the same acclaim. They constitute an important body of literary work, as they were the first books for children that described all aspects of the American frontier, as well as being the first series to grow up with the reader. And the author of the books was rightly lauded as a significant children's author. There were several libraries named after her, awards given her. But despite her growing fame, she and Almanzo lived simply on Rocky Ridge Farm, just as they had always done for the rest of their lives. Almanzo's health was weak in the 1940s, and in 1949 he suffered 2 heart attacks, passed away in October of that year. Since he had remained a Master Mason in good standing for all these years, he did receive a Masonic burial. Laura passed away 10 years later in 1957 at the age of 90, and she was buried next to Almanzo in the cemetery. So almost everybody in America, and indeed I've talked to many people from other parts of the world, they also know Laura Ingalls from the television show. And they all realized that this was a family of faith. They had a very close family. They strived to better themselves and society. They promoted charity, patriotism, and education. All of these values, of course, are extolled by Freemasonry as well and were important during the westward expansion of America. The Masonic Lodge and Eastern Star provided social connections in their busy and often solitary lives, a network of associates across the socioeconomic spectrum, power in numbers to get things done, and assistance in a time with no welfare or social security. Today, Freemasonry and its dependent bodies provide the same benefits.